Today I want to talk about Nixon's non-Watergate legacy. It's a complicated legacy. There are so many things that happened during his administration. But as we back up through history and we look back at his actions other than Watergate through the prism of history, probably the single most important thing Nixon did was to take us off the gold standard. The United States had always tied its currency to the value of gold, and the rest of the world tied their currencies to our currency. And as a result of the artificially deflated value we assigned to gold so that we could maximize our currency supply, foreign countries began to raid our treasury and cash their dollars in for gold. And that resulted in a gold outflow that really handcuffed policymaking in the United States. And Nixon wanted to hype the economy as his re-election approached in 1972, and he was having none of this. So he convened an international conference and announced unilaterally that the United States was going off the gold standard, which meant the rest of the world did too. That has ushered in, since then, in the early 70s, literally more than 40 years of floating currencies, speculation, killings being made in the international currency markets. You couldn't speculate because until Nixon went off the gold standard, it was a certain number of pounds to the dollar, a certain number of francs to the pound, a certain number of each marks to the franc or to the dollar, and they were set, they were pegged. When Nixon went off the gold standard, it floated freely. And the result was that basically government could print money. And it ushered in a period of radical inflation during the 1970s and the speculative booms and busts that we've had since then. In retrospect, it was one of the worst decisions a leader could make. Now, you can't put the genie back in the bottle now, although some advocate going back to the gold standard. But in fact, it was a short-term political calculation to get him reelected by hyping the economic growth. But in fact, it really set the stage for deficits and speculation and all kinds of fiscal malfeasance in the era since then. On a more positive note, he was the first president really to take the environment seriously, pushing and agreeing to the Clean Air Act, vetoed the Clean Water Act, and his veto was overridden. He set up the Environmental Protection Administration, probably rolling in his grave over that one. His real goal in the economy was to impose wage and price controls and hold inflation in check. Johnson and Nixon both refused to raise taxes to pay for the Vietnam War. And as a result, we ran huge budget deficits, had enormous inflation, and that inflation crippled the American economy during all of the 1970s until Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve Board tamed it by setting interest rates up to 18%, forcing a recession on the economy, and eventually getting rid of the inflation. In foreign policy, it was mainly Nixon's forte, and other than extricating us from Vietnam after a very tortured period going through it, we talked about that in a previous video, where he secretly bombed Cambodia and then invaded Cambodia with no congressional approval, led to huge demonstrations, people were killed, and really escalated the tensions in this country. But other than that in foreign policy, his big contribution was to go to China. Ever since Mao and the communists had taken over China in 1949, the United States has said, China doesn't exist. We're not going to have anything to do with it. We won't recognize it diplomatically. We'll recognize the little government in Taiwan, the island, as the legitimate government for all of China. And it was a ridiculous policy. And Nixon could breach it because he had a reputation as an anti-communist and as a conservative. And what he did was to change the Cold War from a fight between the United States and Russia to a three-way battle of the U.S., China, and Russia. And whenever Russia became too obstreperous, Nixon would cut some kind of a deal with China. And China would become scared that Russia would become scared that the U.S. and China were going to gang up on it, and it forced the Russians to back down. He also really was the first president, Johnson did a little bit about it, to try to wind down the Cold War with bilateral agreements, a policy that had some merit but ultimately wasn't as effective as Reagan's policy, which was just to defeat the Soviet Union and force its implosion. Next Saturday, we'll talk about Watergate, which obviously came to dominate everything and is the most important enduring memory of the Nixon administration. Thanks for watching.